hi, can you tell
Hi.
me a little bit about, can you give me your name for starters, and
Yeah.
a little bit about either what you do or a hobby you have, something that you like, enjoy. I won't necessarily make you talk about your job as well as saying, like, you don't have to if you don't want to.
Yeah. Okay.
You can definitely start with your name.
Yeah, so my name is Ruth. So I was working in LGBT rights, and now I work in community engagement. And what's a hobby that I enjoy? I think probably my main hobby is going to the theatre. I went to 111 shows in 2022. It's currently April 2023. I've already hit 60. So, yeah, no,
you live in London.
Yeah, living in London definitely helps. I'm very adept at finding cheap tickets to things, because I have been unemployed for like 4 months. So despite that, I've still gone to 60 shows this year. But yeah, it's great fun. I think if you live in London, like, you have to. And I kind of influence everyone that I know. Like, the longer they know me, the more likely they are to go and see theatre shows. So I'm like making that happen.
Cool. I was at 2 theatre shows this week, so...
Nice. What did you see?
I saw a show called You Bury Us, which is over in Richmond. I think it's still on.
I think I've seen that. I've not been to it, but I think I've seen it.
A friend of mine was assistant directing it, which was pretty cool.
Amazing.
Yeah, and that's about, like, the aftermath of the uprisings in Egypt, specifically Cairo.
Oh, I did see something about this. Yeah, that rings a bell.
Yeah.
Amazing.
It was beautiful.
Yeah.
And then I saw Medea.
Amazing.
I think Ben Daniels is a little bit gender.
Yeah, no, Medea was fantastic.
Yeah, and Sophia Cordero was like, I mean, it kind of did what I wanted it to do. Which is like Ben Daniels, like, riding on the wet floor and covered in blood. And her, like,
in a vest.
Yes, in a vest. And Sophia Cordero towering above him, with blood up her arms, just being like...
But, like, so composed.
Yes. Her whole face, like, you are pathetic.
Yeah, she was fantastic. The Soho Plays have been putting some good things on.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've never, like, this...
They're a brand new theatre. They opened, like, 6 months ago or something.
I made the horrendous mistake of showing up at 7:30 because I'm so used in the morning to get like day tickets, because I'm so used to, like, there's always going to be a queue. So I was like, 7:30, that's got to be fine. Nobody showed up until 10. Yeah, no. It was wild. Anyway, sorry. To get back on track, football. Hi. Yeah, can you tell me a little bit about when you've played football and how you got into that? Yeah,
so I started playing, I would say probably 7 years old. I think I was 7 years old when I started playing football, at my primary school. So like I went to like various different clubs and trainings and stuff. And then when I was like 10, 11, played for the primary school team. And then when I was in year 5, my teacher at the time, her daughter played football as well for a local club, so like recommended to my parents, because once you age out of primary school you have to start playing gendered football. So she was like, my daughter plays for like a girls football team, I think Ruth would really enjoy it, that kind of stuff. So I started playing for a local club, and then fortunately my high school had women's football, because it was a very like sporty, I went to a state school, but it was a very like sports focused high school. So I played for the girls team throughout high school and for my local women's club. And then when my club kind of like, the team kind of closed when I was like 17 or something. They like graduated you to, because we played in like the under 16s, under 17s league, and then they were kind of like, now you can play in like the open league or whatever. But that was with all of the adults, so everyone kind of moved to different, everyone either kind of stopped playing or only played for their school. So I continued playing for school but not for a club. Or some people went and played for, trialled for like Manchester United, Manchester City, because that's where I'm from. And so I kept playing for my school, and then when I moved to university, that's when I kind of stopped playing. You have to kind of pick a sport at university, and I played hockey and football for all of those years. And I think because like I'd stopped club football a couple of years before whilst I've been playing hockey for a club and for my county for a while. I think like when I moved to university, I kind of picked that one. And I played football on my year abroad. So when I was living in Spain, I played football. But other than that, I've not really, and like a couple of kick-arounds here and there with friends. I've not really played since I was like 20, 21. I'm 27 now. But I am currently trying to find a team to play for. I moved to London in 2020, so I'm like settled. I have a hockey club that I play for, and I'm trying to find a football team to play for that like doesn't clash with my hockey. But I'd like to find, I'm trying to look for one that's like, that plays in the inclusive league, so like the London Unity League or something, because I don't particularly want to play for an all women's team. I play for a women's hockey team at the moment, and it's a bit weird. But I don't really want to, hockey is like quite gendered, and they have mixed teams, but it's not like super competitive, it's more like a bit of fun. And they don't have like inclusive leagues and things like that, and I don't want to play for the men's team. But with football, I'd like to play for like a queer team or an inclusive team or a trans team or something like that. So that's kind of where I'm at with football at the moment.
So I'm just trying to figure out if this is the right phrasing, because I don't want it, because I realised that this can be quite contentious, and I was like, I promise I'm not like
no, go for it.
I was like, how do you feel about like women and non-binary as a descriptor for a team?
I think it's interesting. I don't love it. I prefer the phrase marginalised genders, because I think when people say women and non-binary, usually what they mean is women and AFAB non-binary people. And if you're like a non-binary person who was assigned male at birth and is like not super femme presenting, I don't think you'll actually be accepted in that space. So I feel like marginalised genders works better. Or like for sport, you can just call yourself like inclusive or open or something like that. I think like, you know, we're not playing at a super, super high level, so it's not that deep if you have like anyone playing for you. So I think it almost feels, especially in sport, it feels for me like it comes from this like friction between being open and inclusive, and also between people still kind of having it somewhere in their minds that like women and men can't play together and are different abilities or different strengths or naturally different or whatever, which feels very ahistorical, because that's not the reason that we have women's sports in the first place. So that like frustrates me, so I don't love that phrasing.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I didn't want to like I thought I'd ask since about it, but
that makes sense.
I don't want to like rag on people who are on those teams, because I understand that they've also created a lot of space that hasn't previously been there.
And I think it also comes from like it mostly exists in football. Other sports, other team sports, I mean, I'm coming from a hockey perspective on that, like haven't done as much, aren't as queer to begin with. So women's football is very queer to begin with, so they've kind of taken a few more steps, and I think it comes from being a women's team and then having someone join your team who identifies as non-binary and being like, oh, maybe we shouldn't call ourselves a women's team, we should be like women and non-binary, because we've got that as well. So like it comes from that, so it makes sense. So like I don't see it as like bad allyship, I guess. I just see it as like, okay, now maybe we take the next step to something better than women and non-binary.
Cool. All right. Just go back a little bit, just to talk about some of the teams that you've been on in the past. Because there's been obviously like there's a big overlap between like non-binary and transmasculine footballers and the spaces that we've occupied, and women's football, because most of us spent X amount of time being either identifying as women because we didn't know better, or like being slotted into that place in whatever way. And so like obviously there's an overlap between this discussion and discussion between like what kind of support exists in women's football. So when you were playing on those different teams, did you feel like not necessarily for you and your and how you identified and the gender you were going, but like the teams themselves, did you feel like there was like wider support for them and funding for them in the same way as maybe the boys teams had, or not? and you know, it's fine if there was. I'm interested in like spaces where.
No, definitely. It's funny. I call it the football dyke to transmasc pipeline, because it's real. It's so real. No, that's a really interesting question, because definitely not the same levels of funding. Definitely not the same levels of support. I said earlier, like, I was lucky that my state school had a girls' football team, and that was honestly purely because it was a sports school, and because we had like a focus on sport, we got extra funding for sport. And I also grew up in the countryside, so we had a lot of grounds attached to the school, so there was also a lot of space for football and rugby and things. So like the sport availability at my school, and I also grew up in a very middle class area, so the school had enough money, whereas I have so many friends who went to schools who didn't even have a women's football team. So like I definitely had like kind of the better side of it, but it wasn't as supported. It definitely wasn't as funded, and I don't think like it's just like it wasn't really cared about as much. I think it was kind of like on the sidelines, and I think like that comes both from it not being seen as important, and also there were way more boys football teams because there were more boys playing football than there were girls playing football. So they were like, well, obviously if we've got one girls football team for every school year and we've got 5 boys ones, then we're going to put more focus and attention on that. But then it just creates a cycle of none of the girls wanting to play football. So yeah, like definitely not kind of as supported in general. And then I find it really like the like supportiveness within women's football when it comes to like queerness, I find really interesting, because so I played for a club from the age of like 10 to 17 or something, and throughout that time no one on my team was openly queer. I came out as like gay, I guess, or bi or whatever. I came out as like some form of queer right at the very end of high school, and it was kind of after that football club like was no longer going. But if I go on Facebook now, I would say 75% of the girls that I played football with on my team are now some form of queer. Like, so everyone kind of waited until after high school to come out. So it wasn't supportive or unsupportive in that way, because it wasn't a particularly unsupportive place. There wasn't much like open homophobia in the same way that there was in school, in my club, but it wasn't like explicitly supportive either, because no one really was like openly queer or had said anything or had figured anything out at that point. So it was like in that kind of liminal space of being somewhere that was definitely more accepting to be a bit different and to be a bit more masculine and to be like a tomboy and that kind of thing, but queerness wasn't even really talked about at all. And I think that just stems from the fact that like we were teenagers and it wasn't talked about at school either, and it was literally never once mentioned at school, and we kind of like, I grew up under like the shadow of Section 28. I think it was overturned halfway through primary school, something like that. So I think like that all kind of played into it. So I definitely like used sport as somewhere that felt like more accepting for me as like a teenager who was, or a kid who was gender non-conforming and like a bit like weird and like didn't fit in, and people were like mean to me about like how I looked and how I acted and what my hobbies were. But like sport was like an accepting place for that, just kind of like generally, rather than like explicitly an accepting place for queerness, I guess.
Yeah, and kind of a microcosm of something happening in that as well, I think.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit what this is about as well. It's like, because we could be talking about apart from the fact that like football obviously is like, okay, it's also like about something that I understand, so I was like, obviously I'll choose football because I get when people are talking football, but also like football's very much a national pastime, so yeah, like I think there's a relevance there that is like I'll circle around to it in a little bit, because I realise that won't be segueing really hard suddenly into a completely different set of questions.
Okay.
But yeah, I just I'm very interested in like the way that you're talking about football, like the fact that nobody was coming out, but they were all being drawn to that space.
Yeah.
And then the school itself obviously not having that kind of language, which I think is probably quite. I think like us younger millennials might be like the last generation at the moment in this country who've been like quite deprived of having that language until most of adulthood, which is a very interesting thing, because I'll be interviewing you at 27 and I've interviewed a few younger people who'd be like, oh, when I was 11, I'll be like, cannot relate.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. And it's interesting, even like, so I'm one of 4 and my 2 brothers are younger than me, and the youngest is 5.5 years younger than me, 6 school years. And even just the difference between like my schooling and his schooling, and like he was starting high school when I was finishing high school, so like we did kind of overlap just about. Even that difference is wild. Like just in terms of like anyone talking about it, any teachers being openly queer, and just like the kids themselves being like more free and more open and like more knowledgeable. Like even just that 6 years made such a difference.
Crazy.
Yeah.
It's being a young millennial is weird in some ways.
Yeah.
Like, I remember when there wasn't any internet and computers, and now that's like 90% of my job.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just to circle back a little bit, because you were talking a little bit about the space that you are looking for right now, marginalised genders, which is a term that I quite like. I think you might be the first person to have mentioned that specific term, so for that.
You're welcome.
Although their sentiment has been definitely repeated. What, just to go a little bit more into it, like, what kind of, I guess, idealised space is it that you're looking for right now, both in terms of like the community aspect, and also in terms of what kind of team you'd like to play on, like more or less competitive, and also there's a lot of questions baked into this, so feel free to be like, wait, what was the second half of that? And also maybe like 50 years from now, like for that generation, like what might those idealised spaces look like? Yeah.
I mean, I think, so one thing that I find quite difficult with sport is that I'm looking for quite a competitive space, and because I've played for so long and played at like a very competitive level for most of my life, I very much want to play for like a competitive team, and I'm not particularly interested in like my only sporting like clubs or whatever being like a fun kick around. I'm much more interested in like a competitive team, which makes it much harder to find something that is inclusive, because the more competitive it gets, the more likely it is that the league is gendered, or that the teams are gendered, or that just everything is much more gendered. So that definitely does make it harder. It's made it harder in hockey as well, and I know that it will like make it harder in football. But I think for like what I'm kind of looking for and what I'd like to find is a team that is like, I would say my preference would be to play in an inclusive league. So a league that is kind of open to anyone regardless of gender, and therefore for a team that is inclusive regardless of gender. But I would be happy with playing in a women's league, but on a team that is kind of openly queer, I guess. So like especially in London, there are quite a few different like queer clubs or queer teams, or like teams that are kind of like much more openly inclusive than just being a women's team. So like that would be my preference if I can't find something that's like genuinely, regardless of gender, you can play kind of thing. And like the one thing I don't want to do is play for a men's team. And like I think I will always feel that way. So I have it in my other sports as well. Like I'm very aware that like as I become more masculine looking, and like as my kind of medical transition continues, I will feel like less and less welcome in that space. Not by my own team. The team that I play hockey for right now is they're fantastic and they're lovely and they absolutely accept me, but like in the league in general and people on other teams. But I mentioned it briefly, like the history of why women's sport exists, and like I love women's sports because the reason that women's teams and women's sports were set up was because people were marginalised by their gender and they weren't allowed to play sport and they were banned from playing sport, and so they set up women's spaces. So like it comes from that marginalisation, and like that really I think follows through and carries through in a lot of women's sports spaces, that there's that understanding that this is a space free from that marginalisation, and that doesn't exist in men's sports. So I think like despite being transmasc and like despite over the years I will be more and more kind of masculine presenting or masculine looking to like the cis world, I'm not particularly interested in playing in a men's league for a men's team because it's not that like open inclusive space, and it does kind of just, it doesn't have that history and it doesn't have that understanding. And like I know like men who play sport and I know what the men's teams are like, and it's like not something I'm particularly interested in. So I think like the goal is kind of inclusive regardless of gender, and I think like for the 50 years question, that really is like what I would view as the ideal, is like being able to play sport regardless of what your gender is and not having it be categorized in that way, especially when you're playing for like a local club or something and it's like we're not at the Olympics, it's not that deep. Like you, like I think that conversation is much more difficult to have when it gets to like professional sports and professional sporting bodies and stuff. Like that's not a conversation I'm particularly, I don't know, interested in being involved in, and I think there's people who are much better placed to be in that, who are in that world and who play those sports professionally and who are trans. But I think when you're talking at like a local level where it's like, I mean, we're competitive but we're here for fun, we're not being paid, we're not trying to be paid, we're not trying to make the national team, I don't think it really matters. And so many sports already have mixed leagues and mixed teams and people have kick-arounds regardless of gender, so like it already happens and it exists. So I'm like, why can't we kind of formalize that a bit more? So I think that would be like the 50 years dream of it being like a league that was inclusive regardless of gender. That would be nice.
Cool. I have a much bigger question, so I'll start with a oh, I'll say that it could be that you have like a really good like very like comprehensive answer to this one as well. Not for you specifically, but do you think that there is something that men's teams currently, like, I'm struggling to say cis men's teams because I'm like, even when they try to be trans inclusive, like I think they have a lot more internal barriers that they need to overcome to understand how to actually be trans inclusive, beyond just writing it on a website.
Saying that they are.
So what do you think for like transmasculine people in more of a general sense, what do you think that cis men, let's just say cis men, organisations that currently mainly or only consist of cis men, what do you think that they need to actually be doing to have transmasculine people want to be on their teams? And also, sort of a follow-up, like, do you think might also just be like almost like a question of and again, I think this might be contentious because I know that there are some people who are very like, actually I don't want to play with cis men, and that's like as a final, but could there be a way that they might be joining like other marginalised spaces or like marginalised gendered spaces, especially maybe gay men, but they're following these sets of rules rather than the rules that they're used to setting up, so they're actually being invited into spaces rather than being the ones who are like, hey, we're so open. So a bit of everything.
So like on the first part, I think like obviously there's just like so much work in the future to happen to make men's sports an inclusive space for anyone who is marginalised, and especially for people who are marginalised because of their gender or their gender presentation. It's not an inclusive space for cis men who are like feminine presenting or who are gay or who are bi or whatever. And like I can say that from experience because I played sport in university and we spent a lot of time with the men's teams, and it was a horrible environment and very homophobic and transphobic especially. And I mean, I really think like in an ideal world I would say like break it back down to the bare basics and rebuild from the beginning, because I think the reason men's teams are like that comes from an entire history of men's sports being that way and men's sports existing in a wider world that is that way and is very what's the word I'm looking for when something's like super like machismo. Is there an English word? I don't think there is.
Machismo,
just machismo.
Machismo is right, yeah.
I don't know. I think of it as a Spanish word. So I think there's a whole history of men's sports being that way and like being very toxic spaces, and that comes from them existing in a wider world that is full of machismo and full of that kind of patriarchal structure. That then the men who play these sports obviously then exist in the wider world and also kind of live their lives that way and aren't challenged on it. So I really do think like I would kind of come at it from an abolitionist perspective of like you do need to kind of rebuild this. I think there are like some kind of reforms that you can do in terms of like training and resources, and like men's teams really like walking the walk rather than just talking the talk, and like getting involved in like I don't know, trans fundraisers or like trans inclusive events, and like actually showing up and being there and like showing that they want to be an inclusive space and learn and change. And so I think that like is probably the actual way that it would happen. And I think those reforms like are possible, but I think it takes a lot of work, and it also takes the cis men who run these spaces and own these spaces to want to do it. And I think that's like the difficult step actually, is making them like want to do it and want to do something other than just kind of talking the talk and being like, no, we're trans inclusive or LGBT inclusive because like we have a rainbow on our website, and so therefore so I think like it is a lot of that, but it also exists within a wider culture and a wider space. So it's very difficult to make cis men's sports a super accepting space when they exist in like a wider culture that isn't. So it also kind of comes with that entire development of changing the culture and changing society, and that's like a very long-term goal. So it's difficult. But in terms of cis men being involved in like sports spaces that are for marginalised genders, like when I say that my goal is for something to be inclusive regardless of gender, obviously they're involved in that. And I think like when you have constructed a space like explicitly to be inclusive of people who are marginalised because of their gender, and it's constructed by them and for them, then like the cis men coming into it are coming into somewhere that has those rules in place and has those expectations in place, and there is accountability if they violate those norms, and like proper accountability. So like 100% would like, I would love to play in a football league that was inclusive regardless of gender, and that there were cis men and women playing with people of all other genders as well. And I think that would also be a really great space for a lot of cis men to be in, because I think I know a lot of cis men who are deterred from playing sport because they've seen what it's like, and they've seen kind of the football culture and the rugby culture and the university sport team culture and the hazing and that kind of thing, and they don't want to be a part of that. And so they're also deterred from sport, and like whether that's just because they don't like it, or whether it's because they're gay or queer, or whether it's because they're like neurodiverse, or like literally anything, they're also deterred from that space, and that makes the space only open to a very small subset of cis men. So I also think that an inclusive league is a really good thing for a lot of cis men as well, and it just like creates a space where you can be who you want to be, and no one's going to question it, and no one's going to be rude to you, and no one's going to bully you, and that doesn't exist in cis men's sport at the moment either.
That was great. Oh, amazing. I was just like, oh wow, yeah, no, that's cool.
Have some tea.
Yeah, have some tea. Go for it. I'll sip mine as well just for a second.
It's what, like, I've seen some things in university sport, let's put it that way. I won't detail.
I believe you. Yeah, no, I also, because it's complicated because I also am like, I'm very gung-ho that I want people to feel safe, but I'm also very aware of the fact that, like, somebody on T who's got a beard might be indistinguishable from a cis guy.
Yeah.
A trans woman who's not out yet might be indistinguishable from a cis guy. A non-binary person who's balding might be indistinguishable. Like, so it's a tough one. Like, yeah. How do we create safe spaces? And also, like, yeah. So I like asking the utopian one because I'm like,
exactly. I think if you have a space that is open to, like we mentioned earlier, if you have a space that's open to women and non-binary people, or even if you have a space that says marginalised genders, in the kind of culture that we're in right now, in the society that we live in right now, if it's not constructed well, especially, but also with some of the language that is used in that way, it's not actually inclusive, and it's policed, and people will be policing people's gender and people's gender presentation. And if they read someone as a cis man, whether that person is non-binary and assigned male or female at birth, like whether that person is a trans woman, whether that person is a transmasculine person, whatever, if someone reads someone as a cis man, they will often police that, and they will make a fuss, or they'll say they feel unsafe, or they'll say that person isn't welcome there, and like that's a horrible experience for someone to have. So like, I think something being completely inclusive and allowing cis men in as well also means that anyone who is read as a cis man feels much more comfortable in that space, because they know that they're not going to be policed in that way. And I mean, I always say like like activists in like abolitionist spheres, when it comes to policing in prisons, say like we can't just abolish policing in prisons, you need to kill the cop in your head. And I think that really applies when it comes to gendered spaces, is that you need to kill the cop in your head, and it's a lot of unlearning, and it's also a lot of laying down guidelines when you create these spaces in terms of not policing people's gender. But yeah, like I think people are often very prone to policing each other, and even kind of like even if they don't express it, kind of policing them in their head and then acting a certain way based on the presumptions that they've made. And like trans people do this as well, and trans people do this all the time. And so I think like creating a truly inclusive space where everyone is involved, including cis men, is part of killing that cop and stopping that kind of policing of gender from happening.
Yeah. And then like along with that, we might get a bit more normal about testosterone and
right.
Yeah, I think it's a long-term goal. We're working on it, right?
Yeah. I
think,
and there's a lot of like, I understand where kind of some of the fear around masculinity and very masculine presenting people comes from. Like, I get it, you know, like I've grown up facing misogyny every single day, so like I get it. But I think like it can have really harmful effects sometimes when it's not like a very specific trauma-informed space. If you're just like kind of reading masculine presenting people as like bad, I think that can have a really bad effect on everyone involved, and on people who are marginalised genders as well as on everyone else.
Need to be, yeah, no, that's amazing. I'm just, yeah. I wish. Like,
yeah.
I keep reading texts about like how we do different kinds of harm reductions in communities and trauma, trauma, different ways of dealing with trauma that don't involve, just to take a little bit of a tangent, but don't involve policing. Which is, you know, it's very difficult, and it's difficult in sports as well, because like we're talking here about like how do we build inclusive spaces when cis men's teams have like dominated the space, both in terms of like fun, like even just like the amount of teams, and then also like the long history that you were talking about of like, oh, you literally aren't allowed to play as a woman. And to then go and say, oh, what if cis men can be in our space? I think think it's I know it because I'm in it as well. Like it's hard to like wrap one's head around because it's like, but we're building our own spaces and they're the ones who've been like historically excluding others. So that how do we, but it's like, I think what you were saying about the space actually being open to quite a small section of cis men was very good as well. Because like, if we're going to like very high level sports right now, like there are no out gay players in the Premier League.
Exactly.
Which is crazy. Because there's no way there aren't gay players in the Premier League.
Exactly. I think like often people have a very like visceral reaction, and I understand the visceral reaction, but I think often people kind of hide themselves behind language around being trauma informed, and I'm like, your practice can't be trauma informed if your policies are inflicting trauma on people. So if your policy around having men in your space is inflicting trauma on people who are trans feminine but are read as male, for example, then your policy is wrong and you need to fix it. And it's not trauma informed, because actually what you're doing is harming people under the guise of kind of protecting people. Like sports are only open to a small subset of cis men anyway, and I think it plays into a lot of it's kind of queer men, but it also plays into a lot of kind of racial politics around gendering and degendering of people depending on what race they are. And I mean, if you look at like a lot of sports, they're often played by kind of a lot of white middle class people, and they're not open to a lot of other people. And when you look at things like I was saying, the like hazing rituals and the horrible spaces that cis men's sports can be, especially kind of around the age of teenagers through to mid-20s, that's also not a safe space for someone who's racialized, for example. I guarantee that some of the abuse that they throw at each other is racist. I guarantee that the abuse is ableist. Like, I guarantee that it's horrible in other ways as well. So it's like you're really narrowing the field of the number of cis men that feel comfortable playing that sport and being in that space, if like that's what they can expect to face. And I mean, if we're talking football, like the Premier League is a prime example of years and years and years of racist abuse being hurled at players, both by supporters and by other players. So like, if we're talking about building an inclusive space and building inclusive sports, I think we do also need to look at men's sports and how non-inclusive they are, and kind of look at the bigger picture.
Which I think is a really good little segue moment to go into like a little bit what you were saying earlier, and also what you're saying right now, and also to very briefly, but I promise we're not actually going to talk about it, to very briefly acknowledge that there's some really stupid shit being said. And a lot of it is weirdly obsessed with framing access to sports purely through everybody's going to be on a national, international team, everyone's going to want to join the Olympics, everyone's going to be playing at that level, and completely ignoring literally most people who play sports or want to play sports, or just the fact that most people ought to be doing some kind of activity, right? Versus what I think an ideal queer theory and trans theory of building spaces can look like, including in football, around like building community spaces, building spaces that are better for your mental health, building spaces that are intersectional. So they think about trans people, they think about the intersection of race and gender and disability. What do you think that if people were listening to trans people, if people were actually being like, oh, what is it that trans people are looking for in all this sports conversation, how do you think that benefits everybody?
I think it's like very parallel. So one of the big reasons that there are loads of anti-trans attacks on sport and access to sport is that is almost a gateway to anti-trans policies in other areas. And I think it's a really, on behalf of like the anti-trans campaigners and the anti-gender movement, it's like a very measured tactic that it's a way for them to kind of get anti-trans policies on the board and get people on their side about something that kind of people see as less contentious, or people really understand as it being a gender split being important, and kind of it's an easier way to get people on board, and both kind of wider society and legislators, and to then from that be like, okay, we've banned trans people from sport, or we've placed down these restrictions, now let's go into healthcare, now let's go into other areas in school, things like that. So sport is a really good gateway to those other things, and I think that therefore means that there's parallels to those other things. And I think one of the great parallels is healthcare and access to healthcare, and the current struggle between pro-trans and anti-trans policies, and the kind of fight between those two groups, and the attempt right now for anti-trans groups and legislators to legislate away people's access to healthcare. The pro-trans view is really all around bodily autonomy, and it's about access to bodily autonomy, and it's about being able to make decisions over your own body, right? And that intersects with so many other people's rights and so many other groups that are also fighting for their rights. And so one of the best examples is kind of like women's groups who are fighting for abortion and who are fighting for access to reproductive health care. That is also about bodily autonomy, and that's about someone having the right to choose over their own body and over their own womb. And so it absolutely parallels trans healthcare and access to trans healthcare. It's about having that choice over your own body. And I think that kind of parallels in sport as well. It's like, if we are trying to make sport a more inclusive space, and if we are kind of trying to implement pro-trans policies when it comes to sport, that has an impact on other groups as well, who also don't have access to these spaces or are discriminated against in these spaces. And I think like one of the easiest or best examples is that they have done chromosomal testing in the past. So they've done chromosomal testing in the past for like pro athletes, and they stopped doing it because so many cis women, it turned out, had like intersex qualities, or had things that they didn't know that they had, and had been living their entire lives not knowing that they had a certain balance of testosterone, or they had a certain chromosomal pattern, whatever. And so it was the impact on cis women. And like these days, obviously we see a massive intersection between anti-trans policies in sport and both kind of intersex phobia and racism. And so the first people being impacted by these policies are black women and black female athletes and intersex athletes, and black intersex athletes specifically. And so it's like, if you're fighting for that autonomy in sport and that inclusivity in sport, you need to make sure that the fight is for everyone, but also the kind of pro-trans groups, I think, really need to understand. And I think the importance of kind of the pro-trans position is that it's for all of these other groups as well. And it's about that equality for everyone, and that inclusivity and that access for everyone. And it does have a ripple effect. And so, you know, some of the first people impacted by these policies aren't trans people, but they will be, and they are at the moment. And that will trickle down to other cis women as well. And so when it trickles down to kind of like the non-professional sports, and when it trickles down to local clubs, for example, cis women who are masculine presenting, or who, I don't know, have PCOS, for example, and have high levels of testosterone, and maybe have like features that show that on the outside, will also not be able to access sport. And so I think it's like really important, and I think it's like very prudent to understand that this fight is kind of for everyone, and it's not just for this like small 1% of the population. It's like, this has a massive impact on other people as well.
Well, obviously the 1% of the population is really cool, and
yeah,
we want us all to be super happy.
Clearly.
Yeah, I mean, because I also think about, again, not to dwell too much on this side of things, because I'm more interested in talking about you. But like, some of the things that have been proposed in America with like testing girls to see whether they're female enough, and it's like a horrendous invasion of like, I mean, like it's disgusting, and it will absolutely stop any girl from playing sports.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, the fights are all, it's all connected.
Yeah, exactly. Every single kind of policy that is being fought on every level, whoever it's affecting, like the anti-trans policies in this conversation, all of them are kind of constructed by this cis heteropatriarchal structure, and it's the struggle we're in at the moment against kind of right-wing groups, and in the US, for example, fundamentalist Christian groups, is them trying to implement that cis heteropatriarchal structure and us fighting against it. And that's why it has such an impact on so many different groups. And the example of kind of the policies that people are trying to implement in US states at the moment in school sports and girls sports, with like gender testing or tracking periods or things like that, are a massive invasion of privacy, and it's a massive issue of misogyny and sexism, and it's a massive issue of women and girls' safety. And it then all ties into like, you're absolutely gonna have male teachers who use that policy to their advantage to abuse young girls, and like it all ties together, and it comes back around to that bodily autonomy conversation of like, we need to have control over our own bodies, and that includes children having control over their own bodies as well. And all of these anti-trans policies, whether they're in sport, whether they're in healthcare, and whoever they affect, because they are a wide range of people, and not just trans people, but in this case cis girls and cis women as well, are anti-bodily autonomy, and they're anti-autonomy, and they are anti-autonomy for women and girls as well. And so many of the groups who are promoting these anti-trans policies are anti-women and girls groups as well. And I mean, that's why like the whole thing is referred to as the anti-gender movement, because all of the groups funding these fights and funding this legislation being passed and pushing it have historically also been anti-abortion, anti-reproductive rights, pro like the Christian family model, that kind of thing. So I think if you're building a trans space and a trans-centered space, a trans-inclusive space, you start from safety, and the very first thing that you kind of build in order to create that space is this idea of safety for everyone, and making sure that people are safe from harm but also feel safe to be themselves. People can freely express themselves. People feel safe in their own bodies, in the clothing that they wear, and that's kind of the foundations upon which you kind of build the rest of the space, whatever it is that you are building, and the rest of the kind of policies or guidelines or rules or however you want to describe it for that space. And I think that's what's really important in building a trans space when it comes to sport, is like starting from that kind of safety and making sure that everyone feels safe and secure in that space. And I think in sport it's especially important that people feel safe in their bodies and feel unjudged and feel like they can safely kind of wear sports clothing, and people won't view them a certain way, or people won't react a certain way or say anything to them about their body or make comments or anything like that. And so I think like from my experience of kind of very good trans spaces, that's what the foundations have been. And so I think if you're building something that is trans inclusive, that's where you really need to start. You need to make sure that first off, every single person who may come into that space, not just the ones who are in it from the beginning, but anyone who might come into it in the future, will be safe and will feel secure and understood and welcome in that space, and you then build from there.
Cool. Thank you. Complete side note, I wanted to ask earlier, and then a lot of really great stuff happened, so yeah. I got sidetracked, but in a good way. What position do you prefer to play, if any?
I'm a goalkeeper. And like, interesting question as well, because the reason I'm a goalkeeper is because I started playing football at the age of like 7 at my primary school, and I was the only girl that played in my primary school. And so I was playing on the boys team, and I was playing with only boys, and it was a very misogynistic space. And so I used to kind of turn up to training and they'd be like, ew, why is she there? And like, girls can't play football, you know, all of the standards. And one of my teachers actually had to like sit all of the boys down and be like, you have to pass the ball to Ruth, because they would never pass to me in training, or if we were playing a game, they literally like wouldn't pass the ball to me. And so I started playing in goal because it meant that I was guaranteed to actually get gameplay and to touch the ball. And so I started playing in goal at the age of like, I don't know, 8 or 9 or something, because that meant that I actually got to play football where I was playing. And then I kind of just stuck with it. And so I'm still a goalkeeper now. But yeah, like the reason was literally just because of misogyny in the game.
It's a hell of a drug, and it gets them
Yeah.
early. Fucking
Yeah.
hell. So I was like, for a second, I was like, oh, ew, that's cool. You got to play with, you know, well, and then I was like, okay, no, it sucked. Sorry.
Yeah, no, not great. And I was during high school, I was a referee as well. So when I was 14, I qualified as a referee. I did like the FA qualification, and refereed the games for the local clubs in my area. So like the kind of under 11s to under 13s boys games, and that was not a fun space to be in. So like I enjoyed refereeing and I enjoyed it, and I got paid 20 quid a game, so it was, when you're 14, that's great money. But it was like a very horrible space, and you know, I was refereeing like 11-year-old boys, and they were very happy to be openly misogynistic and to kind of try and hurl abuse at me. And like as a 14-year-old, there's only so much control you can have. And like I was refereeing in my local area, and everyone goes to the same high school, so you know, then I would like, some of these boys would see me like walking to school and be like, oh, that's the shit referee or whatever. But it was so clear where it came from, because at least 50% of the abuse I got was from the dads on the sideline. So I was like a little 14-year-old refereeing their sons, and they would be like screaming abuse if they ever thought I got anything wrong, or they'd be like, you know, the classics, should have gone to Specsavers, or like, she doesn't even know the offside rule, like all of that kind of stuff. And it really was so clear that the reason these 11-year-olds were so misogynistic was because their dads were, and that was also very intertwined with football for them. So I doubt most of them saw much of this from their fathers anywhere else. Obviously, some of them definitely will have. But I think for most of them, football is where their dads are openly misogynistic, and the rest of the time it's much more coded, and it's much more integrated into their roles or their lives. But football was where they saw their dads being openly misogynistic and shouting misogynistic things, and being very open about that. And so I think then for those boys, it was okay because they saw their dads do it, and also it was okay because it was football, and that's what football is, and that's what football's about, and you're allowed to do that, and girls don't know about football. My dad said so. So like it was it was horrible, but it was also like a very interesting like learning experience in terms of like how that functions and how it recreates.
Would you be interested in being a referee for like, I mean, in a queer space, slash in a women's space, where I'm like in the overlapping space?
Yeah.
Would you be interested in being a referee in those kind of spaces?
Probably. I mean, I haven't done it in years, and I do. I umpire hockey sometimes because everyone has to kind of do it at least once per season. And I don't mind that, and I quite enjoy it. So I think probably, and I think it would be quite nice. And I think it would be interesting, because the last time I refereed a football game was when I was like 17, 18 or something, and it was this like horrible atmosphere. So I think it would be quite interesting to actually get to referee a game where like the people are on your side and don't hate you from the beginning, from when you turn up before the game and they see you.
People just don't suck.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you just speaking of like alternative atmospheres, because I think that's something that's really interesting, because obviously I think football is considered a very laddish thing, but it's very interesting because like obviously like there is a very robust history of women playing football, and specifically again like gay women, like lesbian, bisexual women join football is. I mean, it's weird because obviously, like, the contrast is like no out gay players in the men's leagues,
right? And
there's
hardly any out straight players in the women's league.
Like, and it's interesting to think about, like, okay, so there's actually a whole parallel world that's being created almost.
Yeah.
That, I mean, I'm sure there are probably more queer cis men who are like interested in being supporters and audiences in those spaces, but it'd be interesting in seeing. In thinking about like whether this is not a question, I'm just sort of wondering out loud in a way, but like whether them getting to see, or like young boys getting to access like queer spaces of football at a young age maybe would give them an entirely different perspective of how to engage in sports atmospheres.
I think so. And I think like when I was a teenager and I was refereeing, I was obviously playing football at the same time for a girls' team, and so I was witness to the stark difference between girls' football and boys' football, and the atmosphere and the way that the players treat each other. So when I was refereeing boys' football, the boys were horrible to each other. Like, if they did something wrong or if one of them messed up. I remember there was a game, they were like 11-year-olds, and one of the teams was losing like 10-0 and it was not going well. And the poor kid in goal was like this 10-year-old who was nowhere near his growth spurt yet, absolutely tiny in comparison to the size of the goal. And his team were being horrible to him, and his coach and the parents were being horrible to him as well, and were blaming him for their loss and blaming him for letting all these goals in. And it was just like such a toxic environment. And as a referee, like, there was only so much I could do. So I can kind of tell the parents they're not allowed to swear, or I can tell them they're not allowed to abuse the other team. But like, I can't really control the fact that the coach is telling this poor kid off for letting in too many goals, because it's his coach. And like, you don't really have control over that. It was horrible. And then I would play women's football, and like, someone messes up and it's like, unlucky, better luck next time, great ball, like, that kind of thing. And everyone's supportive. And our coach was always a man, and most of the parents watching were dads. It was a few mums, but it was mostly dads watching as well. But they were lovely, and they were supportive, and they were not abusive to anyone, and they wouldn't abuse our players or the opposition. And so it was like, it's not just a gendered thing, because it was also, the male coach and the male spectators were also acting completely differently when they were at a girls' game compared to a boys' game. So it's like this entire, it really is like parallel worlds, and I was like kind of straddling these two parallel worlds of completely different understandings of what football is and what sport is and sportsmanship and that kind of thing, and also what watching football is and how you should act. And I think it's kind of like come back recently, because there's been a surge in people going to women's football games, professional women's football games, since, the Lionesses won the Euros, and since before then when we did well at the World Cup, and there's been like a lot more focus on women's football and professional women's football, and so more people are going to women's football games, and it's a completely different atmosphere. And I know people who have said that they would way prefer to go to women's football games, because they're like, the spectators are nice, the crowd is nice, it's a great atmosphere.
Did you hear about the match that was played on Trans Day Visibility?
Yes. I'm in the Slack channel for Trans Radio UK's football stuff. So potentially the football team that I'll join, depending on what gets set up and what league they're joining and all of that kind of stuff. Hopefully, I'll be able to join an all-trans football team, which I think would be really cool. And they're kind of the game that they played, so they'd played an all-trans feminine game last year, which I went to because it was at Dulwich. So I went to watch it, and it was amazing. And I think that generated quite a bit of interest. And then the one that they played recently, that was the first all transmasculine team, generated quite a bit of interest. And so now there's like trans people up and down the UK who are kind of, they're corralling into online spaces to see if people can set teams up. So It's really, really cool, and I think like their end goal is to have at least like some five-a-side teams in some of the more like densely populated areas across the UK. But yeah, very cool, very, very cool. And I think especially like in the kind of space that we're in right now, where there aren't many like actually inclusive teams or actually inclusive leagues, I think having a space that is all trans is like really important, and also like very special and feels very safe. I went to was it 2 years ago maybe, I went to an all trans cycling session at a velodrome in London, that was run by, I can't remember the cycling group. There's a really cool like inclusive cycling group in London, and I can't remember their name, that's really bad. But I went to an all trans cycling session at a velodrome, and it was like so much fun, and everyone who went and the people who were coaching were all trans, and like it was like such a special experience because everyone felt just like so safe, and like sport is really a space where like your body is on display and you're using your body, and for trans people I think that can be quite difficult, and so having a space that is all trans is actually like really, really important in that aspect, because you feel so much safer, and like no one's looking at you, or no one's like doing a double take, or no one's going to make any comments on what your body looks like, and whether or not your body kind of conforms to what they expect when they see your face or when they hear your name or hear your voice. And so like with football and with the kind of all trans teams that have been set up, like I think it's so cool, and it's something that I am kind of trying to get involved in.
Yeah, I think literally in the last couple of years, a lot's been going down specifically with football, which I can kind of a little bit attest to, just because I started trying to put out feelers for this project about 2.5 years ago, and there was very little.
And now suddenly it's boomed.
Yeah. So it's just very exciting.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that like speaking of like in this case transmasculinity, the minute there was any kind of like hey, this is a space for you, the interest just went. Like it was like, where are they? And it was like, oh no, we're all right here, we're just waiting.
Right, like the people are there, and the people are kind of waiting who have played football and who have loved it and enjoyed it, and who don't play at the moment because they don't feel safe playing, or they don't feel welcome, they don't feel like there's a team that they fit into, and like they're literally all there waiting. So as soon as there's a call out of like, we're setting up a trans team, you will get so much interest, because there are so many people who want to play and who aren't currently playing because there isn't a space that they feel is for them, but they're all there like on the sidelines ready to be called on.
So I think there's an analogy one could make there about being on the sidelines and being like extra player substitute or something. Yeah. Like, we're right here.
But like 100%, like in the kind of group chats that I'm in of people setting up these teams, every single person pretty much who introduces themselves is like, I played football for this many years, I played in school, I played for this club, I haven't played in this many years, I've been wanting to get back into it. That's like, and that applies to me as well, and that really is like the template that most people introducing themselves in these group chats follow, because they played when they were a kid and then it got difficult, or they stopped because they faced transphobia, or they started to transition, they didn't feel comfortable in the team they were playing in, so many different reasons, and they haven't played since, but like it's still there, and there's that yearning, and it's like as soon as there's a space, everyone jumps at the opportunity because they really want to play, and like it's such like an important community thing to be able to play a sport and to feel welcome playing a sport.
This is so true.
Yeah.
That's me. I feel almost annoyed at myself. I was like, the minute I left London, it was like, oh, there's a bunch of football happening in London. All right, it's fine. But it's beginning to happen in Leeds as well.
Yeah,
so
it is happening kind of all over, and it's kind of starting to happen all over. So I think like people in London are often privileged literally just because there's 9 million people who live there. So there's just more trans people, apart from the fact that there's obviously an exodus from rural places to London, especially because people want to live in a big city and want to live in the capital. So like often you're quite privileged that is much easier to find a trans group that already exists, and you don't have to do the work to set it up yourself. But it is starting to happen across the country, definitely. It's exciting. It's very exciting.
Cool. We're sort of slowly nearing the end as well.
Uh-huh.
So despite all of this, just like in a very broad sense, what's your favourite thing about playing football?
I think it's being on a team and playing for a team. I hate going to the gym. I hate exercising on my own. I've always been a team sport person. Every kind of sport that I've been involved in, every exercise that bit of exercise that I've done over my entire life has been team sports. So I think like the thing that I love most about football is that like sportsmanship and that team sport aspect of it, and like being in a team and having your teammates around you, and it not being like something that you do on your own, whether that's like working out and practicing or whether that's the competitive aspect and playing. Like I think the thing that I love most is doing it with other people and relying on other people and having them rely on me feels really good, and it creates like such a close-knit sense of community, because when you're playing a game, like you have to rely on each other and you have to know where they're going to be without even looking, and that's what makes a good team. And so like building that and being a part of that and feeling that kind of sense of camaraderie and solidarity and community is like the most important thing for me.
That's amazing. And would you be up for, if you have something off the top of your head, sharing maybe an anecdote about something that was fun or surprising or awesome, a memory that's like related to playing football?
That's a difficult question. I feel like whenever people ask me to like come up with, like to think of a specific thing that's happened, my brain immediately goes blank. And it's like, do you know in The Simpsons when it's like that monkey with the cymbals? That's what my brain starts
Never even played football. I don't know what you're talking about.
What's football again? I don't know.
Alright. You don't have to either.
No, I think I would say, so I said that when I was like 10 years old, my teacher recommended to my parents that her daughter already played for a girls' football club, and that might be something that I'd be interested in, because I was at that point only playing for my primary school. And I think that first training session, because I had been playing on the boys' team at school and with only boys, and facing a lot of misogyny from them and not getting to play and them not involving me, them not passing the ball to me. And so then going from that straight into an experience that obviously at the time, before I knew I was trans, was a completely inclusive experience that I fitted into and that I felt like I was a part of, and going to a training session where people were like nice to me and wanted to play with me and thought that I belonged there and that I should be there, and that feeling of like actually having the ball passed to me for once in my life, is like such a fond memory and such like a fond and really like important part of like my experience in football. Was like that was my first experience of an inclusive sporting space and an inclusive football space. So I think I would say that.
I love that. That's great. And then we can bring that forward and be like, and now looking for more.
Everyone!
I want everyone to feel this way.
Turns out.
Oh, by the way, yeah, it's happening, and I don't know. I feel like this is more like a wrap-up thought on my part, but you know, feel free to jump in. But like, I feel like there's a testament to how like adaptable and resilient and like and joyous we're able to be.
Yeah.
That we keep on building these things. Like,
exactly, and I think that's why women's football specifically is the space where I'm seeing inclusivity and inclusive teams, and teams that are for people who aren't just women, and teams for marginalised genders, or teams for women and that kind of thing, because it's always been a struggle, and women's football has always been a struggle against gendered violence and gendered discrimination. And so this is just like the next step in that struggle, and that's why you see this happening. Part of it is because so many women who play football are queer, but part of it is because it's been that struggle. And why are so many women who play football queer? Because it's been that space to begin with, and because it's been a space where they felt comfortable being and expressing themselves. And so like it really is just the next step in terms of like what women's football has always been, and has always been an inclusive space, and has always been for people marginalised because of their gender. And all we're doing is expanding that language and making that space even bigger, and making sure that the people who maybe in the past would have kind of fitted into that, but who now have the freedom, language, ability to express who they actually are, still fit into that space and still have access to these inclusive spaces when it comes to playing football.
Cool. Okay, we're technically done.
Cool.
Unless there is something that you feel like, oh, I really wish that we gotten into this subject. I really want to say something about this. You have a chance. Like a final thought that you feel like you really want to share.
I don't know.
There's no pressure, by the way.
I think I'd just say that like throughout my life and all the experiences I've had, and like whether that's been good experiences of making friends or like the bad experiences of discrimination and bullying and that kind of thing, like sport has been the constant that has made me happy, and has been the thing throughout my entire life that has been like the stability that I needed, and the place where I felt comfortable, and I've been able to kind of leave the rest of that behind. And I think especially in high school, sport was really important because, you know, in the playground, people could say what they wanted about me, and people would make comments on my appearance and who I was and my personality and my interests. But with sport, I was just good. And I was just good at sport, and I was just good at football, and they couldn't argue with that. They couldn't argue with the fact that I was good at football. And so it was a space where I was safe and I was comfortable, because that's all you needed to be. All you needed to be was good and nothing else. And so it's been such a constant throughout my life, and has like at points been that space where is the only space where I felt like genuinely able to be myself and safe to be myself. And like as an adult now, and as someone who is very open about who I am and has kind of come through the other side of that, like it's still such an important space for me, and it's still something that makes me so happy. And like I want everyone to have that. I want everyone to have access to that and feel that they can access those spaces and feel that they can play sport. And I want everyone to be able to feel about sport the way I do, and to have the option to feel about sport the way that I do.
Brilliant. Also, not that that's necessarily what you implied, but I was just like, gender is sports.
Yeah, basically.
What's your gender? Sports.
Yeah.
How do you embody yourself? Sports.
Yeah. Pretty much.
Cool. I'm calling it.
Cool.
So you did amazing. It was cool.
Thank you.